Today we're going to continue on our discussion of the living world by looking at energy flow through ecosystems. Now, of course, the ultimate source of the energy that we have on Earth is the sun. And you can see that light from the sun filtering through these trees on the tropical island of Bali. Now, before we get to that, however, we still have a few odds and ends to finish up concerning our last topic of biomes. So let's begin there. Now that we've seen all of the world's principal biomes, we can compare them with respect to temperature and precipitation. And we can do that graphically like we see here. So look, for example, at where tropical rainforest falls on the graph. That type of area where temperature is high, but where rainfall is also high. So we find it at the left top of the graph. At the other end of the spectrum, if we look to see where tundra is, it is in an area where temperature averages quite low and rainfall or other sorts of precipitation also average quite low. And all the other biomes fall in between that, depending upon the amount of precipitation and the mean temperature. Now we can also look at this graphically in a little bit different way. If we graph annual patterns of temperature and precipitation in different parts of the world, we get graphs that look like these. They're often referred to as climatographs. And when we compare these climatographs from different biomes, they show striking differences. Notice, for example, if you look at temperature in the boreal forest through the course of the year, the temperature rises in the summer and falls in the winter months. In contrast, in tropical rainforest, the temperature is high year-round. Now, if we look at precipitation, we also see differences in patterns between these biomes. So, in the boreal forest, you have a peak of rain again in the summer months. But it's not as extensive a peak as what you get in tropical rainforest, where you have really two distinct seasons. You have a winter dry season and a summer much wetter season. And of course, in rainforest, even the dry season is not all that dry. These graphs, by the way, are courtesy of NASA, whose satellites can gather this sort of information on parts of the world from space. Now, of course, the thing that drives temperature and precipitation is energy. And as we've already seen, the energy's ultimate source is the sun. Now, the energy from the sun is also involved in another critical Earth process, and that is photosynthesis, the capture of that solar energy by living organisms. Now, although you've all talked about this previously in introductory biology, let's take a few minutes and review exactly what it is that photosynthesis does. There are two parts to photosynthesis. There is the part that involves the capture of energy from the sun, which is referred to as the light-dependent reaction. And then there is the part of photosynthesis that uses that energy that's been captured, the so-called light-independent or dark reaction of photosynthesis. And that energy that's captured is used to make living material. Let's look at a graphic of this. Let's begin by looking at the upper left-hand corner of this diagram, which, by the way, is superimposed over a photograph of our native rhododendron of eastern North America. So light energy comes in from the sun, and that light energy is captured by plants. In this process, the light-dependent reaction, a water molecule is split, and electrons from that water molecule are driven to higher energy levels in a complex interaction between electron accepting molecules, which permit those high energy electrons to be stored, in a manner of speaking. So in essence, what happens is that this light energy from the sun is converted into chemical potential energy, the energy that is stored in electrons within these molecules. Now, a byproduct of all this, the waste product of this initial part of the photosynthetic process, is the release of oxygen as waste. And in fact, the reason why Earth has an oxygen atmosphere is a consequence of the process of photosynthesis. Now, once that energy has been stored, it can then be used in the second part of the photosynthetic process, which is the light-independent reaction. Now, the exact process that goes on in the light-independent reaction depends upon what kind of plant you're dealing with. But a typical one is referred to as the Calvin cycle, which again involves a complex interaction between electron-carrying molecules. So in this light-independent reaction, carbon dioxide is the raw material. And energy that was stored from the light-dependent reaction is used to convert, in a series of steps, carbon dioxide into a carbohydrate. A typical carbohydrate would be glucose, which is C6H12O6. And that, in a nutshell, leaving out all of the complex chemical steps involved, is the basis for everything else that goes on planet Earth. That's actually a bit of an overstatement. It's not quite everything else, but much of what we see when we look outside and see the living world is based on this photosynthetic process. Let's consider what's going on in this photograph here in light of some elementary physics ideas, which we might refer to as the laws of thermodynamics. What we see here is wavelengths of light coming in from the sun to the earth. We have very long wave radiation coming in the form of infrared radiation, that stuff that we usually refer to as heat, and very short wave radiation coming in the form of ultraviolet radiation. And then we have all that other stuff in between. We have visible light. And of all those various wavelengths, plants use some of them. They tend not to use much of green light, and that in fact is why plants are green, because they reflect that light, but they do use wavelengths in the red and blue end of the spectrum. Those electromagnetic waves that the plants use have their energy converted to another form. As I said, we could refer to it as chemical potential energy, the energy associated with holding atoms together in molecules, the energy associated with electrons in orbitals around nuclei. And this brings up the issue of the first law of thermodynamics, also referred to as the law of conservation of energy. The fact that In our everyday world, energy is not created or destroyed. In theoretical physics, it's a bit different than that, but in our practical everyday world, that would be a statement of fact. This energy can, however, be converted from one form of energy to another. And indeed, that's what plants do. Not just plants, by the way, but all photosynthetic organisms. You should realize that photosynthesis is an extremely ancient process that originated in Precambrian times with bacteria-like organisms. Those things that we refer to as cyanobacteria, or commonly referred to as blue-green algae, that kind of bluish scum that you might find on the stone steps of your own house or on a cool north-facing slope of a hill on that side of a tree or something like that. Blue-green algae are still with us in great abundance and continue on that process that their ancestors originated a very, very long time ago. Let's formalize this thought like this. Here we have a definition of the first law of thermodynamics. Energy can be neither created nor destroyed, but can be transferred from one form to another. Now, this brings up the issue of the second law of thermodynamics, which is the phenomenon of heat flow. Think of the term heat, by the way, as a verb rather than a noun. That's the way that physicists think of it. Thermal energy, heat, flows from areas of high to low temperature. Temperature, if you recall, is simply a measure of the amount of motion of molecules. And so molecules that have a great deal of motion, a great deal of kinetic energy, in other words, can transfer that energy to molecules that have less kinetic energy. As high energy molecules bounce against low energy molecules, the energy is transferred to them. So heat flows from high to low temperature. So hot objects make cold objects warmer, is another way of saying it. Cold does not flow into hot. Hot flows into cold. So we have to realize that these fundamental physical laws of energy flow are what underlies what goes on in ecosystems. So let's consider these laws in light of what goes on with photosynthetic organisms, like these black-eyed Susans that you see here. In order to grow, these organisms have to use that first law of thermodynamics. They need to convert light energy into chemical energy, which can then be used to manufacture living material. That process, by the way, of doing this is referred to as productivity. The rate at which living material gets manufactured, if you wanted to say it very simply. And so the fact that you see these flowers here and their green parts and all that is a testament to the fact that the first law of thermodynamics is operating. Now, of course, all of the productivity of a plant or any photosynthetic organism doesn't necessarily become living material. It costs calories to stay alive every day. It costs calories to deal with all of these sorts of other things that go on in the environment, like this squash beetle eating leaves from my squash plants in my vegetable garden. Plants have to compensate for that. They have to use some of that energy that they're capturing to do things other than just make new living material. And so we can think of the total amount of energy captured as gross production, but the amount left over after metabolic costs of all sorts as being net production. We can summarize all that like this. Definition of primary productivity, the rate at which energy is bound by photosynthesis. And by the way, the usual units of primary productivity are kilocalories per square meter per year. The gross production would be the amount before costs are factored in. Net production is amount left after costs are factored in. Now, one other term worth mentioning is the term biomass. People tend to confuse the terms productivity and biomass. Productivity is a rate. Biomass is an amount. So if we go out and measure the amount of living material in a square meter of field, let's say, that figure is the biomass. It doesn't tell us at what rate that living material is manufactured. It simply tells us how much is there at a single point in time. Now, one thing to consider with biomass, however, is that the above ground part of photosynthetic organisms like plants is not necessarily all of the biomass. There's also all the stuff that goes on under the ground, all the roots. And so a complete measure of biomass would consider not just the above ground part of plants, but also the below ground part. Now, once that energy gets captured by photosynthetic organisms, it then gets transferred to other kinds of living organisms in a series of steps. These steps are generally referred to as trophic levels. The first trophic level being represented by this plant right here. This is a soybean plant. If you've never seen soybeans, it's one of the principal agricultural crops of North America. Very important crop for use in livestock feed, although it's also eminently edible by people. It's the stuff that all kinds of soy products are made from. Everything from tofu to all sorts of processed foods have got soy protein in them from these very beans like you see in front of you here. Those beans, by the way, when they are young like that, are also directly edible. You can bring them in and steam them and eat them. The Japanese refer to that as edamame. It's a very popular thing in Asian diets, and it's becoming more popular in Western diets. Eating fresh soy like that is a very good thing in terms of healthy lifestyle. But in any event, I'm digressing. What we're looking at here is the first trophic level. The primary producers, those who are directly involved in capturing light energy and turning it into the living material that you see here. That living material manufactured by plants can then be consumed by other organisms. So, like this tiger swallowtail butterfly here, landing on the flowers of this plant and then extracting nectar from them. Other animals like that squash beetle that I showed you before might actually consume the leaves of the plants directly. But in any event, they are eating, all these kinds of things are eating materials produced by photosynthetic organisms. So they are referred to as primary consumers. The first kinds of organisms that consume the products of photosynthesizers. The next trophic level involves organisms that eat the organisms that eat the photosynthesizers. Animals like this black-capped chickadee here is an insectivorous bird, and so he is eating things that eat plants. To be sure, he is a little more versatile in his diet than just that, as are a number of kinds of animals. And so rather than calling him strictly a secondary consumer, we might also refer to him as an omnivore, because chickadees, although they do eat animal material in the form of insects and things like that, they also eat plant material like seeds. And so they are not just secondary consumers. They're a little bit more versatile. You can see he's also trying to consume me here without a whole lot of success, fortunately. Here we have perhaps a better example of a secondary consumer. This is an eastern milk snake, and snakes in general tend to be entirely carnivorous, meaning they only eat animal material. And that is true with the milk snake, which is a predator of mice. And the mice, in turn, would be eating plant material, although again, mice can be, like the chickadee, omnivorous. They might eat animal material as well. Mice can eat insects, for example. So the relationship of trophic levels is again a bit blurred. Although we might call this a secondary consumer, it's not entirely fitted well into that category. Then we have organisms that we could refer to as occupying the highest trophic level, the tertiary consumers. And we can think of birds like the bald eagle as being tertiary consumers, although again, when you investigate their diet a little bit more carefully, like some of these other creatures we've been looking at, it's not quite that simple. We could define a tertiary consumer as an animal that eats animals that eat plants. And indeed, eagles can do that. They might eat ducks. They might eat fish. And in fact, this particular species, the North American bald eagle, is really more or less of a fish specialist. And it will eat a wide variety of different kinds of fish, including predatory fish that eat other fish. So it really is a top carnivore in a lot of ways. And that's led to some problems for it, because when you are at the top of the trophic pyramid, you are also, in addition to getting through a series of steps from photosynthetic organisms, you are also getting whatever kinds of toxins are present in all these previous trophic levels. And so birds like eagles and other tertiary consumers do tend to accumulate some bad things. In the 1950s, eagles accumulated agricultural chemicals like the pesticide DDT, and this led to them having widespread reproductive failure. It wasn't that they were eating the DDT directly, but they were getting a little of it from the animals that they did eat, which were accumulating it from the animals that they ate, and so on. However, even with all that said, when we look at the diet of the bald eagle, it still is even a bit more complex to discuss than that. It's not just a tertiary consumer. They also, these eagles tend to be scavengers. Much of the fish that they eat, for example, is dead fish. And so we can also refer to them not only as top carnivores, but we can also refer to them as scavengers, detritivores, organisms that eat the dead remains of other organisms. Now here's one other group of organisms that we can mention. The organisms that are involved breaking down dead remains of other organisms. They are referred to as decomposers as a group, and they include things like fungi and algae. And these strange organisms here, these orange things, are called slime molds. They used to be thought to be fungi, but it appears that they have a closer relationship instead to things like protozoans. So the decomposers are the organisms that break down such things back into their component parts. And once they are in their component parts, the molecules, the chemicals that they are composed of, then those chemicals can get recycled through ecosystems. So we can summarize the topic of trophic levels like this. We can think of energy being passed from one group of organisms to the next through a chain-like sequence. So it's often referred to as a food chain. And at each step in that food chain, at each link of the chain, we have a trophic level. The beginning of the chain would be the primary producers, also known as autotrophs, which means they make their own food, which is exactly what photosynthetic organisms do. These organisms are the ones that capture light energy from the sun via photosynthesis to create living material. There is, by the way, one other group of organisms that gets their energy in a different way. That's why earlier on I said that the situation was really a bit more complex than I was initially telling you about. There are these creatures, bacteria, that are referred to as chemoautotrophs. And this kind of a lifestyle is even a more ancient kind of a lifestyle than carrying on photosynthesis. This is probably rather like what the first life did at the earliest stage of life on Earth. They would have derived their energy from chemical compounds. And there are, to this day, still organisms that do things like that. You can find remnants of early Earth at places like hydrothermal vents. You can even find some sorts of things like this inhabiting the bottoms of lakes. These primary producers are then consumed by primary consumers, organisms that eat these things. And they are referred to as heterotrophs, as are all organisms that eat other organisms. And these primary consumers are also referred to as herbivores. Animals that eat plants are referred to as herbivores. And from there we go to organisms that eat the primary consumers, so we can refer to them as secondary consumers. And then there's the organisms that eat the secondary consumers, which we can call tertiary consumers, also called top carnivores. And as I illustrated with some of the animals I chose to show you, things are not really quite that neat. Nature is rather more messy than that in the relationships among all these different kinds of organisms. And one other group we can refer to are the decomposers, organisms that break down the remains of other organisms. Bacteria and fungi are principal among those kinds of organisms. So with this discussion, we will close for today. And next time, we will continue on this topic of energy in ecosystems and how energy makes its way through the ecosystem.